So, okay, so thank you very much. It's been a really inspiring set of talks. We have a few questions, but I think I might just, I think I would quite like to, before we start on the questions, just say, if everybody just in 1 minute could, on the panel, could say, I'll give you 2 ticks to think about it when I do mine, what they see like the biggest risk at the moment or challenge in the current landscape as we find ourselves now. So I think Chris and I were talking, so things have really moved. This is now on the agenda. There is funding in it. There is an open conversation, but the statistics haven't changed really. And so I was going to, while they think about it, I was going to say one of the things that I think is the biggest risk is, for me, the narrative is changing. So the narrative is changing, and it's not necessarily changing in the direction I think it should. So I think there's a risk that the narrative is now changing to the fact that we should value a greater and more diverse set of characteristics. And actually, that's a different issue to systemic barriers. So a very different issue. And I worry that it actually diverts away from the idea that people are discriminated against, and actually their CVs look different because they have suffered systemic discrimination, and moves us towards an idea that actually we should just value a broader range of CVs. And I think it's an extremely dangerous narrative that lets everybody excuse the current scenario. So I'm going to be very cruel now and shift down the line and see if there are any comments anybody else would like to make about risk.
I think one of the risks coming from that idea that we want to be embedding things around the EDI action plan is what I've kind of discussed already with some people, is people that maybe haven't thought about this so much can feel that overwhelmed by the scope of things to do and think, oh, there's so much I have to change. And is to actually allow people to understand that we really recognise that everyone is at a different place here, and that as long as we're all moving in the same direction and we've kind of got an agreed set of principles to work towards, all those contributions are valid. We can't all lead networks like what you and Simone are leading, but together we can all move in the right direction, hopefully. And we don't want people to feel like, oh, if I'm not doing everything, then it's better to not do anything. Or, you know, I don't maybe myself feel like I've been a victim of discrimination, therefore I don't have a voice and I can't say anything. There's a place for allies, and there's a place for those that have maybe benefited from the system to actually stand up and contribute there. So we wouldn't want to alienate people that maybe aren't at those places.
I think one of the risks is by professionalising the practice of EDI and starting to value it more, we risk drawing in bad actors who see it as a way of actually advancing their careers off the back of EDI funding or being seen to be doing the right thing rather than actually doing the right thing. So I think there is some value in professionalising and measuring it and sort of valuing it, but there is that risk that it just becomes another way of, you know, kind of advancing yourself rather than lifting up many.
Good point. Yeah, well, 2 things occur to me. One is that barriers are not something that exist and then you remove them. They're something that are constantly being rebuilt all the time. And it worries me meeting younger scholars reproducing the idea that that some of these barriers are facing them, sometimes whether they are or aren't. So that worries me. And the other thing is related to what you said, which is around the obsession with data and documenting. I think there is a risk that we spend so much time collecting data that we don't actually do anything about it. So that's a risk that we have to avoid.
I just want to echo your last statement there in terms of realizing what we are identifying. I think that is a huge need. I personally don't know how to solve that, gap, because data publication, we understand the statistics. Okay, where is the gap? Then, of course, we have to take the help of, I suppose, politicians, because that's where policies can be implemented, and sometimes it just diffuses and then we don't see things happening in reality. So I think that is.
Yeah, I'm going to go with the data one as well. So when we were preparing the slides, Kate and I were talking about this, and we decided not to present data, although we could have done. I think one of the things we've seen in the past with EPSRC is interpreting interpreting data too early. So I give an example was we used to say CDTs were really good for addressing gender balance because the data suggested that. However, it was at a time where we had it in a relatively small part of our portfolio, and particularly around the life sciences. When we opened it up to the full breadth of EPSRC disciplines, it just reverted to the norm. And so there's nothing particularly interesting about CDTs for addressing gender balance. I mean, there's lots of other things that they do really well. So I'm a big advocate of them, obviously. But yeah, being careful with how we interpret the data and how we interpret the data over a period of time. And I think that's possibly that sort of more social science, longitudinal studies, I think would be really interesting.
Okay, so I'll do a couple of questions here. I don't know if people, are you all capable of posting questions because we have roving mics as well. So I'll start with one here while you think, and then I'll see if there's anything from the audience. So, so the first question I'm going to ask is, how do we change the hearts and minds of those who are not convinced by EDI, especially if they are in powerful positions? And I think this comes back to the chipping away at your own pedestal remark.
I don't think we can change them. I'll be honest, I've been asked this question a lot over the last 3 years, and I think yeah, there's a couple of people have talked to the US about it. I just don't think we can. I think we just need to get rid of them.
I was going to say,
I mean,
in that sense, okay.
I think we can. I think we should physically change them, but I think actually spending a lot of time trying to change deep-rooted like beliefs about what the value of meritocratic frameworks. You know, I just don't. I think people, when they're that saturated in themselves and what they've grown up with, I just can't see how they can change. But that's just me feeling, you know, slightly pessimistic. But
I mean, the traditional answer is to get them young, isn't it? To change people before they get to that position.
Positions, are they?
No, but they might get into them.
Yeah.
That's a very long-term perspective.
It is.
That's, you know, that's a kind of optimistic, strategic, longer-term approach, which is obviously what we're trying to contribute to.
Yeah.
But you're right, we have to change the structures around them that support them.
Jim, I think you were gonna.
No, I completely agree with both points already made. I think the other thing is that people self-improvement. I mean, in terms of what's to their benefit, what's going to improve their university's standing, their company's standing, and that back to things of PwC. So I think that's probably the way I'd start. But I think there are certain people you won't check that.
But I think they're incompatible sometimes, right? It's like the government talking about a growth-based economy. You know, sometimes at some point you have to concede that, you know, your standing may actually take a hit or stagnate because you are implementing things that make your local environment more equitable. So I do think motivating by universities motivating themselves so they get higher up some other times higher table is a poor motivator. Myself, but I'm not in charge. I was never made in charge.
Perhaps unless some of those statistics actually become part of how we measure, and I mean real data like the gender pay gap and the number of people from, you know, how well you represent the demographic locally, so your local demographic within your university, how, you know, these things could become part of that ranking system. Plausibly, and that is certainly the focus of mine, in my experience from Central University. Right, oh, this is wrong. Oh, I need a password. So, can we have a question from the audience, perhaps? Well, I work out how to stop this.
Hi, I'm Miriam Roda from Aston University and the Supergen Bioenergy App, and one kind of like phrase I haven't heard here yet is collective ownership, because I think EDI, the activities we do and getting people involved, and that kind of like comes back to how do we get rid of the people who are not convinced or don't want to commit. It's about collective ownership and getting everyone involved and understanding the reasons behind decision making or specific behavior. So to the panel, how from kind of like the, or maybe in particular to the two new networks, kind of like how can that be addressed to actually get people on board and not just say we need to get rid of a certain type of people, because then the question is how inclusive are we actually, but how do we create an environment where people understand that inclusion, equity, diversity is part of the story, and provide that kind of like knowledge exchange, education, and collective ownership to show that is relevant, and also maybe to EPSRC on how can that be a bigger part of actually how we do research in the future to ensure these issues are addressed, and not just kind of like going the easy way and saying like, oh, we just do it based on data or kind of like the typical processes we have.
All right, lots of questions.
You want to go first? Oh,
You
or do you want- So I think actually we've got some really nice examples, and I've been very parochial because they're the ones I know in energy, where groups like UCA have had a really great sort of interdisciplinary approach for a number of years, and got a really quite a good sort of story to tell around EDI. We've seen recently sort of big changes across the Supergen hubs where certain Supergen hubs, obviously your own included, have really sort of helped lead the way. But I think we've seen sort of perhaps some of the stragglers make really big strides in the last couple of years, and putting in some really interesting sort of approaches to EDI, which are not data driven. I think the sort of different mechanisms to put in place. So I think there's some good examples to be built on, and I think sort of that came across really nicely, I thought, in the presentations, and that you were looking at best practice, particularly around the Inclusion Matters project. I think that's sort of a really important way for us to go. But certainly we see sort of our government structures. So, for example, Supergens have a high-level group. They really hold the hubs sort of feet to the fire on EDI every time. And if they don't deliver on it, then they sort of say, okay, you've got to get an action plan in place.
Until they say you've done too much, what they did with ours.
Did they? Okay.
Okay, let's move on. So there's a question here, which again is for UKRI. So there was mention of opportunities for early career participants to join the UKRI EDI peer review process. Is this open to someone already working, or will it be applied for only as a fellowship opportunity?
Okay, so there's the peer review college. I think that's what they're probably referring to. So if you just search for EPSRC peer review college, then you would find information about how to join that. So it is pretty straightforward. And then that will put you into our reviewer pool. You'll be invited to review applications, and that will give you, I think most people think that when they review applications, it helps them to write better applications. So it's kind of part of that, bringing everyone along. And we have from our work on race and ethnicity, we do know that we have underrepresentation of those from ethnic minority backgrounds in our peer review college. And so we're particularly keen to encourage people to self-nominate and join up to the college. So I think, yeah, if you are not in the college, please explore it. And if you are maybe quite an established person, this is open to academics and industry as well. This isn't just for academics. If you are somebody quite established, it would be really great to encourage your more junior colleagues to explore joining it.
Okay, I have another question that I'm going to ask, but I'm not entirely sure which terminology they're referring to. So if it's from the audience, perhaps you could expand. Are EPSRC going to address their use of technology and how this affects individuals and minoritized groups?
So I think this is definitely something we're always learning, and I do apologise if I've used the wrong terminology or something. I would hope that somebody wants to come and tell me that. Then it's definitely something we're always learning, and improving. Things do change. So yeah, I think there are certain areas which we have changed since. I guess historically we won't use BAME now. We understand. So I think the statistics that you presented are we didn't disaggregate ethnicity data, but that's to do more with using small numbers and what we can actually present rather than because everybody, we view that as one group. We definitely don't, and the ethnicity report does recognise that there are different challenges in different ethnic minority groups. So we'll generally use terminology from the ONS surveys that are used to collect information on data.
I might add one thing to that actually, and that's that I know it's important to get terminology right, and if you're an official organisation, then that's a slightly, and you're publishing stuff, then it's more important. But it's also important not to jump on people for it, because there are people that are terrified of going anywhere in this space because they think they're going to put their foot in it and say the wrong thing. I say the wrong thing all the time, and I know. And then afterwards, I think, oh God, I shouldn't have said that. That wasn't right. But I hope that I mean the right thing, and I don't intend it to be wrong. And I don't want this to become about the language of the EDI, to be honest. I think the important thing is that we behave in an inclusive way and we try and get it right, and we correct people when they get it wrong, but we do that in a nice way. And then we move on and we give people the benefit of the doubt that their intention was good. Be my
I just wanted to comment on that, if that would be okay. Just with this is my personal experience, not intended to represent any group. Just about what you say about the sincerity of the intention rather than what comes out. And I have mixed feelings about that, because as someone from many underrepresented groups in engineering, in the EDI space, in academia, any sector that I belong to, I'm always underrepresented. And I think being in that position, a lot of people like me, we do have to be very mindful all the time about how we express things. And so I think that, although I completely agree with you, and I know that we're all capable of making mistakes sometimes, I guess my request to anyone who falls under any majority group would just be that you just take the additional 10 seconds that you would need to think anyway before you speak, just out of consideration for the fact that a lot of us have to do that all the time.
Honestly, I don't disagree, and when I recognise I've done something wrong, I try and not to do it the next time. I'm not saying I repeat it, but I can think of a few occasions, and I do know individuals that would like to do more work in this area, but are really broadly terrified of putting their foot in it in terms of language, particularly in things like faculty management committees and that sort of area where they just feel they will get it wrong. So there's and we training courses can help, and pulling people up in a nice way can help. It's just about not also pushing people away from the space.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think part of it is doing what you've just done and being vulnerable enough in saying, I don't get it right all the time. And I think that's sometimes all that's needed, but it doesn't always get said.
This isn't a question as much as a comment, and I think when Chris sat down next to me, I said it's really nice to hear about the emotional burden of a lot of this stuff. And Becky's been my, what did you call it? The people who were giving you the Phillips? No, Chris had a word. It was a Chris word. Anyway, but yeah, Becky's my go-to person when I'm wrestling with certain people over certain issues in a different institution, and who keeps me going, as is my friends who go swimming with me, who's taught her son to say smash the patriarchy. He's only 3. But I'm halfway through reading a book that everyone should read, and everyone should read it in this network for 2 reasons. So one, it's written by Christiana Figueres, who was the UN lead on negotiating the Paris Treaty. So if you care about energy, you care about the Paris Treaty, right? And the book's called The Future We Choose, and it's about how can you keep going in the face of the kind of, quite frankly, Mad Max scenario that we're facing as a species. I'm only halfway through, so I'll tell you the first 2 nuggets of wisdom that she gives you in the book, and then you need to go away and read it. But the first one is relentless optimism. And I know, Chris, you and I have talked about this a bit. It's bloody hard, right? And my daughter, you know, sometimes I come home from meetings, she says, how have you been getting on with the horrible old men today, Mum? Not at this institute, this is a different institution. But you need to have that relentless optimism. And the other thing Christiana Figueres talks about is you need to have a bit of self-care and regeneration. And she talks about that, you know, we need to regenerate the planet, but you also can't work towards regenerating the planet without taking the time to regenerate yourself and look after yourself. And that, I think that that this platform is really important. I've already spoken to people today and they've told me some of their own life stories about crap that's happened to them, and it's really good to be able to talk about that, get it off your chest, go, that happened, but look at this, now we're in this room full of all these brilliant people and we're going to try and optimistically make a difference. And then I'll report back at the next Ignite meeting about the final chapters.
Slight challenge to something that you said about these kind of support networks. I do agree that the world's not going to change because those institutions exist, but I think there is, you know, it's really important to have networks for mutual support in lives that we actually leading in the world today. So I think they're incredibly valuable for that role. But I agree that then they need other changes to happen.
I completely
to go
agree.
beyond that role.
I use Twitter a lot for that reason. It's because there's, you know, when you can't knock on the door next to you and have that conversation, you can go on social media and people just dismiss it as being a swamp and it's not nuanced, it's blah, blah, blah. But actually it's one of the safest places and one of the places where you can get most assured sort of support without any sort of concern then at all. So yeah, I absolutely think support networks can work. It just needs to work for you and it can look very different, I guess, as well.
Yeah.
Okay, we cover this as well. Is this working? Yeah, because it's a bit of an area of specialty for me. So our Inclusion Matters project was about, it was about something different at the beginning, but what we found at the end is that those homophilic networks are really helping to make people feel they belong. So if you have a place, so we work with women in STEM who in their daily life had mostly no encounter with other women, and the fact that they had a place where they could speak with other women, it changed a lot of things for them. It kept them in STEM, it kept them in academia. So I think it's a transition, it's necessary for the transition, but I think we need to use the power of those networks to change the system. So because I think relating it to this idea of having the people that are not going to change, then we have to organize ourselves. And I think that's you know, and also sometimes, as you say, they look different for different people. And we have to acknowledge this as well, because when you try to do everything at once, sometimes we've had a project like that, Chris, where we try to look at every kind of discriminatory characteristics, and everybody has different needs and different things. So sometimes it's good to have places where you address, you can talk about your own needs and then organize yourself to advocate for those needs, I think.
Seeing as the mic is here. So I really like the paper on the Hubble Space Telescope. So it's really clear that if you remove the identity, that you remove the bias in terms of gender. And you know, I really like that the EPSRC have been trialing the New Horizons, where you had the blind review 2-step process. But I just wonder, is there a risk if we continue to trial these processes on small grant awards, that actually we could make the statistics on mean award value worse, because we're taking up the time of young female researchers to write grants for smaller pots of money?
Maybe an additional question for that is, one of those pilots going to go mainstream? You might be able to.
No, I'm not able to answer that. It's quite interesting. So one of our big centres, one of the people I put up earlier, they actually did that for their co-I team. And it didn't change the gender balance, it didn't change the ethnicity balance. The thing it did was the average age of the team went down by sort of 15, 20 years, which I've no idea why that's the outcome. So it'd be really interesting to understand that. But I think sort of now's the time to start thinking about these things. We're changing our grant system. It's going to look very different in well, almost imminently. So now's the time to have those discussions about so what's the one we talked about earlier? So having sort of multiple say PIs, but they wouldn't be PIs if they're multiple, but you know what I mean. So there's a lot of change going on within UKRI, so this is the time to have those conversations and see if we can change things for the better.
Can I just add a comment that I think there is a risk with things like the Horizon. I think it's great to see them, but they use the different grant review process. So you change two things at once, which makes it really, well, you change, yeah, I agree. You change a lot of things at once.
Yeah.
So you have what's effectively a non-expert review panel, where it's very broad in terms of its expertise, and then an interview process that is more, so everything changed. And then you can't tell statistically what is making the difference. And also, if there is no difference, whether it's actually because you're now interviewing people rather than whether you made the original round anonymous, which is why I'm a real advocate of not doing that and just anonymizing the normal case for support and then ticking a box on the track record afterwards, so that only one thing changes at once. And we see, and I worry as well that one of the reasons that you suddenly have far more applications to, well, I'm sure one of the reasons that you have far more applications to these awards from people from underrepresented backgrounds is actually because suddenly they're all motivated to apply because they think they've got more of a chance because they're anonymous, which is also success rate is lower, and the success rate is actually lower than it is in the normal grant round. So the whole thing is just, I'm sorry, I don't, but it is just really difficult to see the strategy behind it.
Yeah, and the first round was also run during COVID, so obviously there was additional challenges with that. I think they were small grants, and if what will be interesting as these come to an end is to start to understand what the next grants are. Did people that were awarded New Horizon grants, are they more likely to move on and apply for bigger grants? What comes in through that? So yeah, there definitely was too much change that we can conclusively say this change led to this. But obviously we're aware there's a big drive from the community to have that anonymous peer review, to have different ways of applying, and it might be the case that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It depends on the scheme as to whether or not it's appropriate to have. I mean, I don't think we can have an anonymous fellowship interview. That's obviously the point. But for these smaller grants, as it were,
an anonymous science case review,
exactly. So
and then a detailed review of the individual, and then an interview.
So it's understanding for the scheme, for the amount of money, for the objectives of the scheme, what we want to get out of it, what's important, and looking at that. And as Jim said, making sure that the system will then allow us to do it, because we don't want to be in a situation where we can't do something because the system will let us do it.
There is also a question about, like, how much evidence do you need to make a change?
I know.
You know, we know that this change is positive. We know it will have good effects. How many times are you going to trial it before you decide to actually go with it? You know.
Yeah. Right, I'm going to move on. I think we probably should just say. So I've got a question for Chris about how, which I think is an important one, about how different are the EDI challenges in the industry, and I guess this applies to Geetha too, in industry compared to universities.
Within industry, like in companies, in the corporate world, rather I would compare at the very top level. We have the triangle, the base triangle is kind of moving to the middle level is fine. At the very top, I think it's the natural position of 3 or 2 decades away, you know, people sitting up there and the mindset there, because those are the experienced, you know, people who, and also the natural gender actually that moves towards that direction depends on where the company is based, depends on the organizational culture, based on the region, geographical location. So it's a lot of elements, you know, to be taken into account. So there's not like one answer in the corporate world how it will work. It might be different in the US based setup than when compared to Indonesia or in Japan.
question, are you finding it better or worse?
Compared to academia?
Yes.
Similar, I would say, similar.
I'll have a punt at that.
Yeah.
I find it less individualistic in the assessment. So you succeed or fail as a team, and I feel less under the microscope. I don't know again what PETRONAS is like, but Jacobs, you feel much more like you're part of a team. You're not gonna. I quite like that. Whereas in academia, there was, and it's different experience for every academic in the room. But for me, objectively, I did. I did quite well as an academic objectively, if you look at papers or money coming in, but even still, you were always feeling that you should be doing something else. So it was kind of that rat race, there was an arms race almost. And having left, I just never, ever feel that. Like I come home at 5:15 and I don't work weekends, I don't work evenings, and I never once think about what is going to happen tomorrow, next week, a month or a year away. It's a completely different atmosphere for me, I must say. So in answer to the question, individualistically, it's better. Now, whether, EDI is just done better in industry, I don't think so at all. I think there's the same issues. I think they're tackling them in the same way. But I think my individual experience has been much more positive because of the way industry works, right? You can't do anything on your own there. You have to, look at our awards for our learned societies. They're a mess, they're all for individuals, it's all that sort of thing. Yeah, but in EGU, we had to fight for years to get the team awards there, because people don't want it, right? Because everybody wants an Einstein.
I acknowledge that
Sorry.
very well, Chris, when you mentioned about the team falling in, moving together, but it depends on also when I mentioned similar, it's the same type of situations when you want to promote people, during the promotional exercise, during the assessment, I think more or less, we are dealing as humans, so there is no better way to actually judge these things. This applies similar.
Yeah.
Okay, you have a question?
Hi, my question is sometimes EDI interventions seem quite performative and turn people off if they don't see real, visible, long-term change. So do you have any advice or comments or experiences that you can share about how to overcome that?
Yeah, I think that's in the design of the two networks, certainly ours. It's like that the whole point is to not do the performative thing and actually document some real change. And that requires time and investment. So that's the key thing. I think, you need this kind of comprehensive, everyone has got to be aware that this is an issue and deal with it. But some people need to have the time to actually act and draw in other people. So I think that's a really crucial element anyway. I don't think we'll ever get away from that performative. Look at the stuff going on around greenwashing. It's the same problem, isn't it? We need real action, but we're going to have to work out how to tell the difference.
I'd like to add to that a little bit as well. So I think, slightly controversially probably, that the focus on Athena Swan Awards has been quite detrimental in many ways, because what it's done is it's put a lot of people that are in underrepresented backgrounds and given them a massive workload because they're all on the committed to Athena Swan. And at the end of the day, most universities and departments simply have bronze awards, which just mean they wrote a load of policies that, as the vice principal just pointed out, quite often sit on a shelf and do absolutely nothing. And I feel the same, actually, a little bit of pushback. I'm sorry, you get a bit of flack, you can arrive for EPSRC, but just a little bit of pushback as well on the need to address it all in interviews and grant applications. It's not that I don't think these things are important, I absolutely do. But what happens at my end is that I pick up the phone and somebody who's applying for a programme grant says, "You're good at this. What should I say to the EDI question?"
Yeah.
It's for you to go and think about it, but that isn't what happens in practice. And we have to think so carefully about what we're asking people to do, because otherwise we actually give everybody a get out clause and make the situation worse for the people that are underrepresented.
Just look at this room.
Everybody's, I know.
Any EDI focus session at a conference, or you look at the room and you want to find all the women, black and brown people, disabled people come to the EDI session, right? They're all in there. They're not in the session in the plenary, giving it the plenary, or, you know, they're all in the room learning and trying to change stuff.
But the dream is that when at the interview, we asked, or get them to the panel to ask the EDI question, that they don't get the two white men looking over to the to the woman who's there. That, I mean, that's very it's really dispiriting every time you do that.
But they
Panels
do
are
see
getting-
And it must be much worse.
Yeah,
for,
but I think panels
individuals.
are getting better at telling when you're getting a kind of stock response. Oh, my university has a Bronze Athena Swan Award. That's what we'll do. And when you have somebody who is perhaps, yes, the very established white male PI who really takes on themselves, this is what I've already done, this is what I'm doing. I can't tell how genuine they're being, but I think you can, there's disparities. I think the panel there's an improvement and a realization that this isn't going away. And the more genuine you can be about it, and the more you've upskilled yourself and you have learned it, then the better that will be. And that's, I guess, coming to the point you made earlier about where do you get these bad actors and people that perhaps are realizing there's an area you can benefit from this by doing it. So it's difficult.
I mean, just go back to your first question about risk. There's always a risk that identity politics trumps real EDI progress. I think we have to be really careful about that as well.
I will move it back later. Hi, I'm Jane Smith. I'm from the Institute of Physics. Thank you for sharing all of your thoughts and comments today. I was just reflecting on what the panel have been talking about and on your slides from the first presentation, Becky, because we were talking about dismantling systemic barriers and how we're trying to move away from a deficit model. But then I was also thinking about the reciprocal mentoring scheme, which the EDI Plus network do. And I was just wondering if we do think that we need to have both approaches in terms of individualistic approaches plus the systemic action to make change actually happen, because I guess in that approach, you're not actually pushing it back on the individual because you're both gaining out of that experience. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that, because to me, that seems like a really good way to maybe counteract some of the issues that were brought up before, like how do we change the minds of people that are not interested in forwarding EDIs? Well, if they see the data and they're ignoring that, if they listen to the experiences of a person that has, you know, real experience of these barriers, then that's a more powerful thing as a human to hear that. That was just my reflection anyway, so I'd like to hear yours.
I do agree about mentoring schemes. We started one last year in the university. Actually, management were very open to being mentored, so it is expanding out, and it was largely thought to be very useful and successful, I think. And it included people like the head of HR, so it wasn't just academia. I also think in universities anyway, there would be real benefit to reciprocal mentoring between professional services and academia, so that there was a better understanding between the two areas, which slightly is not an EDI related issue necessarily, but a better understanding in general between the areas in universities would support progress, is my feeling.
The thing is for me that there are so many useful things to be done. This is a wicked and complex set of issues, so we're going to have to use a wide range of approaches to address it. So one thing alone is not going to solve it, but we need to incorporate all of these great schemes that we know work.
But they do always take more time for underrepresented individuals. Yeah.
I think philosophically, though, we should always only view the deficit model, the application of the deficit model, like you say, as a stepping stone to, right? We shouldn't crave that in 20 years' time, right? Philosophically, I mean, in reality, we might always need people being individually advocated for, but I think we should only ever see it as being something that in the future we won't need.
Okay, I think. How are we doing for time? There's a few more questions on. Oh yeah, Valeska. Sorry, go on.
Hi, Valeska Ting, University of Bristol, but I've spent the last few months in Australia, so I thought I'd bring an international perspective. So over there, there's been, I guess, some quite forward-thinking policies. So having positions and opportunities that are designed to address the gender gap. but like, so some of them, for example, having quotas of female applicants has been designed to change this pipeline and the I guess the diversity of faculty members, but a lot of this has been met with quite aggressive responses from other faculty members, and so just using the opportunity, because there's a lot of experts in the room. What do people think about things that might be seen as positive discrimination to try and address that?
Really odd that people are aggressive against the increased applications, because you're only talking about applications. So I can see, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but I can see when it comes to awards that people might decide that there is. So do you want to talk about the Royal Society of Edinburgh? Sorry, just in terms of what's been done in terms of the in order not to get pushback. You don't go into the political details, but in order not to get pushback about disadvantaging male applicants, the Royal Society of Edinburgh took a different approach. One, you can explain it.
So this was started in 2013. There was a quota for, prior to 2013, there was a number of fellows elected every year. In 2013, there was an extra number of fellows put at the bottom that were only for women. So no male was disadvantaged, because if you were a man and you were below the quota, you weren't in anyway, because they couldn't get in. Over the last period of 10 years, the diversity quota in inverted commas has got bigger, and the number of characteristics that put you in the running for that diversity quota has also got bigger. So the RSC recognises that we have certain underrepresented disciplines. So it's not just protected characteristics, it's disciplines. We're looking for geographical diversity. But frankly, if you are well, I was going to say straight, but actually we don't ask people about their sexual orientation. If you're a white male professor of physics from the University of Edinburgh and you're below the top quota, you're not getting in because you're not in the consideration. If you're a white male professor of art history from Edinburgh, you are in that quota, because arts and humanities and social sciences is one of our underrepresented areas. The other thing that the RSC did was to develop a series of nominations groups to specifically go out in those areas and recruit people. So I would encourage anyone in this room, if you know of somebody in the kind of Scottish diaspora, they have to have some connection to Scotland. Bob Holsworth from Durham got in a couple of years ago because he does his research on Scottish rocks. That's his only connection to Scotland. Actually, he's the chair of the Scottish Geology Trust. If you know of anybody who fits that bill, who you think could become a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, then approach either myself as a fellowship secretary or the fellowship manager at the RSC and get their name put into the nominations group. And the nominations groups include one for female, one for younger candidates. Last year, to my annoyance, there wasn't one, so I set one up. There is now one to address our ethnicity issues, but we also have a nominations group for business and professions, for arts, humanities, social sciences, and there's another one I've forgotten. But those nominations groups, we looked at the stats this year. Once you're in the system, you are no more likely to get elected as a fellow if you come in through the nominations group route than if you come in through the traditional route, which is that a fellow nominates you. So what that's saying is that the nominations group aren't giving you a leg up, they're just getting you into the front end of the sausage machine. And people don't like me using the word sausage machine about people, but any process is a machine for generating an outcome, and how you set that process up will generate you different outcomes.
Yeah, I was going to say one point of order about the language. Affirmative action is protected by law, positive discrimination is not. So I think we often have to be quite precise about the language we use, because it's allowable under law to address a historically generated disparity in representation. So it sounds, I don't like terminology, but I think in that case it actually matters. I think, I'm going to sound a bit trite here, but often when we hear about affirmative action, we think we're lowering the standard of quality. That might be one of the things, though certainly that's what I've read on Twitter about the Australian changes, and we've seen it in the UK. But it's often just nonsense, because people think that there's a meritocratic framework that's worked to get all these white men in positions of power. And you can bet yourself that these white men in positions of power are not sitting around thinking, am I worthy of this, right? They are making hay, and they are, some of them are incredibly good actors, right? They're elevating people. You showed your PhD your your postdoc advisor. There are. It's not to say that everybody's the same, but certainly having some self-awareness about how people have got to where they are. I think that's one thing I've often talked to people about when they've said, "Oh, but if we do this, we're just going to have like rubbish candidates, and they're all going to be brown." And it's not like that. We're talking about very small numbers often as well in very specialist spaces. And the RSE one is a good example of that. I think, they think there's just going to be an influx of underqualified peoples, and there's not, and I think telling people that and showing them examples of where that's not happened often, to answer your question, that helps, is to show them how, where schemes have been implemented, how things have changed and how that's benefited everybody, to try and be positive in the response to those aggressions.
And I just wanted to back up what Chris has said there, this idea of a meritocratic process. So the ref is a process, a sausage machine for turning out a ranking. But if you ask the statistician, there is absolutely jack diddly squat statistical significance in the ref rankings, apart from at the very, very top and very, very, very bottom. So, and the same is true for any of these processes where you're trying to gauge excellence, which isn't a measurable thing. You can measure mass and you can measure it to whatever degrees of freedom, depending on your measurement technique. You cannot measure excellence. It's not an objective criteria.
I just want to echo what you're saying in a slightly different way, that, to talk about positive discrimination is to suggest that discrimination is somehow not there already. So it's a kind of misnomer, isn't it? Let's just, if we didn't have discrimination, we wouldn't need the opposite. And that's kind of the argument, isn't it?
Discriminate in the direction of white men at the moment.
Exactly. Yeah.
Still, yeah.
Absolutely. Right, I'm going to finish with one question. We're half an hour over. Okay, I won't finish with one question. In that case, there are one or two more questions on the chat, and if the panel are okay with it, we might just circulate them around. So if you'd like to give any response that we can post somewhere, I think we can manage that. So we can put some answers up for anything that we didn't get to. Thank you all so much coming to listen to the launch, and for those online, and thank you to our speakers who've all been completely fantastic. Can we have an additional round of applause?